Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we are going to be taking you on a tour of the Cairo Geniza with our expert tour guide, Rabbi Zachary Rothblatt, who is a Judaic Studies teacher at Kohelet Yeshiva in Merion Station, Pennsylvania. He received rabbinic ordination from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary, aka Yeshiva's Rabbanite and Elchanan at YU, where he also earned a master's degree in Bible and Talmud and a certificate in mental health counseling. Rabbi Rothblatt holds both an MA in education and a BA in business from Johns Hopkins University, and, makes sense, you also studied at the Ner Israel Rabbinical College, aka Yeshiva's Ner Yisrael, right? And Yeshiva Kerem B'Yavne. Based in Bala Cynwyd, Pennsylvania, he is currently pursuing a Ph.D. in Talmud at the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies at Yeshiva University. And so we are in for a real treat of the cross-section of Torah and academia and archaeology all coming together today. So I think it makes sense. I know we're going to delve into a particular tshuva that was found in the Cairo Geniza, but maybe for myself and for our listeners, just give us like a little bit of overview of, like, when I hear Geniza, I just think of, like, I go to shul and I have like an old Hirsch Chumash I want to get rid of, so I put in the Geniza. What is the Cairo Geniza?
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Rabbi Kurtz. It's a pleasure to be on here. And really, I find the Geniza one of the most exciting things and finds that we have just in totality from the ancient world. I've been told that it is the largest treasure trove of manuscripts of any culture from the Middle Ages. So we're talking about something upwards of 300,000 fragments. So a gigantic collection. What is the Cairo Geniza? Basically, we know actually very specifically the dates. Sometime in the early 1000s so about 1,000 years ago, the Jewish community in Old Cairo in Fustat actually re-inaugurated their synagogue. And unlike Jews that we're used to, that you bury your shemus, you put your Geniza in the ground, they actually went and put their Geniza in a room. They stored it in what's the size of an elevator shaft, which had their synagogue was 2 floors. So there was, from the women's section, there was a little alcove, and you could just throw things in there. And basically, from the early years of around, 1020, they kept just throwing stuff in there up until the late 1800s. And at some point in the late 1800s, the synagogue underwent renovations, and people became aware of the find, which is a whole story in itself. I would say, just as an aside, if you're excited to read about the history of the Geniza, the book Sacred Trash is a wonderful book written about the history of the Cairo Geniza, how it was found, discovered, etc. Long story short, it was brought to the attention of Solomon Schechter, who was then a professor at Cambridge, who proceeded to take about 70% of the contents of the Geniza and bring it back to Cambridge University. The rest of the contents were spread between different other institutions. And basically what we found out is that there was material in here that had been sitting for basically upwards of 900 years in the Geniza. Stuff that was using until the day before Solomon Schechter came, I've been told. There was material being put in there. And so it's an astounding, and because of the dry climate in Egypt, it hadn't disintegrated a lot of it. It was still there. And what we were basically able to do is reconstruct a rich history of a Jewish community over the course of 900 years.
That's remarkable. Now, what I think is interesting is when you talk about the Geniza, that's, like the book you mentioned, Sacred Trash. That's the stuff people didn't care to preserve. And that's kind of fascinating, because I imagine we found things in there that otherwise were not published. Maybe someone had an old set of Chumash or something that they put in there. I wouldn't be surprised. But maybe even the texts of those Chumashim are already telling. Are there
Yeah.
variances in those texts from what we use today?
So I would basically say that if you had to define what's in the Geniza, I would put 4 different categories. There's the stuff that we have that material, just the stuff in the Geniza. The materials offer us a better girsa, a better text. So you'll have excellent text. The most ancient texts we have of like the Babylonian Talmud or the Jerusalem Talmud, we're going to find in the Geniza. Stuff way older than the stuff we have in Europe. And it gives us an insight to better manuscripts. They're just older. Now, someone may have thrown them out because they just got old. There's always an open question of why is someone discarding something. But usually we assume it's just because it's, with time, something got, worn. But it always is an open discussion whether something was an error and someone put it in there because they thought that it should be disposed of, right? Um,
Ah.
but basically, that's the first thing would be is material that gives us a better insight. Then there's all the lost things that have been lost to history, like lost midrashim that we wouldn't have were it not for the Geniza. I'll give an answer. The Mechilta de Rashbi, the Mechilta of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, we don't have a manuscript of that. It's been recreated using the Geniza and other sources. So,
And that sounds like something essential that I would have
yeah.
thought we had access to for quite a while.
And we didn't until the Geniza finds. They were recreating it from, another discussion to be had, but that's a perfect example. The third thing is I would say, is Gaonica and Rambam, is that there's so much material from the Gaonim that we only have through the Geniza, because that's, 1,000 years ago, the Gaonim were still in charge and people were transcribing it. And so much of our Gaonic material is due to the Geniza, as well as the Rambam lived in Cairo. So we have so many handwritten things from the Rambam. And as you mentioned earlier, we have materials that maybe someone never decided to publish. We have unpublished manuscripts from the Rambam, projects he started and never finished and just put in the Geniza.
So are we talking about like other Svarim of the Rambam? Are we talking about maybe a tshuva here, a tshuva there? What are we looking at?
So, for instance, the Rambam actually writes in a letter that he wanted to make a Rif for Yerushalmi. Just like the Rif took the Bavli and took only the things that are halacha l'maisa, the Rambam wanted to do the same for Yerushalmi. And we found the Rambam's project for this, for Maseches Ksubis and Brachas of Yerushalmi. We found his manuscript of it. It seems he decided to stop and never finished it, but he threw his copies, his rough draft, in the Geniza.
Whoa, you just mission abort. That was it.
I guess he got too busy, but it's
I
fast.
mean, okay, the Rambam was doing a lot of work. We'll cut him some slack.
We even have, they're starting to publish it now. Occasionally, we find notes from someone who attended the Rambam's Shir. And they say, this is what the Rambam said in Shir. And we have like a little, like some Talmud showed up and wrote his notes down.
Do
And
they do they reflect what all the Briskers are saying? Like, does it line up with Reb Chaim's analysis?
yeah, I know people have tried to analyze these things closely now to try to answer questions in Rambam, and it's fascinating, right?
Huh. So they were doing it long before the Briskers came along. You're saying
Exactly, exactly. They were asking him in real time. And so that stuff's all amazing. And then I guess the last area, which is beyond quote unquote Torah, is that it seems, we always joke that you have the people in the Geniza, when you go to a Seamus box and you see like a challah board there, that like, it's like, what's that doing there? But people throw in everything.
ah.
A lot of people threw anything that had Hebrew writing, a lot of people threw that stuff in. To our benefit, we learned a ton about the social history of the people. We have a lot of records that people just threw that have nothing to do with Torah, but they're fascinating historical records.
What are we talking about? Like wedding invitations, or what are we looking at?
So we have ship records. I'll give you one example just to whet your appetite, is that one of the robust trades that we learned about from the Geniza is people were actually traveling down the Red Sea and traveling to India to do business and coming back. And we have their ship records from there.
Fascinating. So what do those tell us about Jewish life at the
I'll
time?
give you a fascinating example, one among many.
And I know we have to actually get to the tshuva of the day, but I'm so curious. I think it's worth really delving into this.
For instance, we have a copy of a Shtar Shichror Avadim, a document releasing someone from slavery that was purchased in India and freed in India. And we have the document that's written Bereshus, the Reish Galusa in Bavel, and the Rosh, the Gaon in Eretz Yisrael, freeing this woman on the southwest coast of India.
That's crazy. Wow.
Right?
And they were still practicing it then, that means.
Exactly. We actually even have, speaking of Avadim, because these things are so, we even have Sheva Brachas for Avadim with Piyutim. What do you sing when you marry two Avadim together?
Oh my gosh, for real?
Yeah, it's not a full seven brachas.
This
but they
almost
have it
sounds like,
completed.
some kind of, I don't know, some sort of like Baharavna concocted or a Minchas Chinuch or something. It sounds like some like concocted thing that's a fun thing to say like in a shiur or something. But these were actual things that were happening.
Actual things that were happening, and they're fascinating. And we get a rich description. We have so many letters back and forth about what's going on, especially also for those who are more curious about the historical accuracy. For whatever reason, some periods got more stuff thrown in the Geniza than others. So we have a lot of information from 1000 to about 1250, 1300. Then the Geniza tapers off for a while. It picks up again after the Inquisition and all the Spanish people arrive. So 1500, 1600. And then it also gets a little quiet until basically up to 1896. But it's really that first period, which is so fascinating, 1000 to 1250, where we've learned it completely changed our understanding of the Jewish world.
Remarkable. And I would imagine there are certainly perhaps the overarching halachic question that has emerged from the discovery of all these ancient texts with varied gersos, with varied versions of the text, is what do we do when we find that there's an incongruence between what we have today? What if, we discover older Sifrei Torah and they don't match up with the wording in our current Sifrei Torah? And that's certainly a worthy discussion. I think ink has been spilled on that topic, but I think you actually wanted to go in a different direction. What's we want to do a tshuva that emerged from the Geniza. So maybe give us a little bit of background. What's the tshuva that we're looking at? Can you tell us who's involved over here, what the case is, and just break down the summary for us?
Perfect. And so what we have in this tshuva, I wanted to bring something to light of an institution that's not well known. Basically, we're familiar with the fact that there are Gaonim in Bavel. We have the Gaonic institution, Rav Hai Gaon, Rav Shrirer, Rav Natronoi. We've heard these names. Until we found the Geniza, we basically didn't know. We had little hints here and there. The Rush mentions in one place, this and that. But we didn't really know that there were Gaonim in Eretz Yisrael.
Huh.
That they had their own first probably in Tiberia, and then moving to Yerushalayim. We had people that called themselves Gaon Yerushalayim, the Gaon of Eretz Yisrael.
It's a pretty snazzy title.
Yeah.
Sounds authoritative.
Indeed. And they were extremely powerful in their community, and they were looked up to as the top authority by all the Eretz Yisrael Jews. And in fact, the Ben Ezra synagogue, which is where the Geniza is from, was a Israeli affiliated institution, meaning there was another shul in Cairo called the Knesset al-Irakin, the Iraqi shul, the Bavli shul. And we didn't find their Geniza, unfortunately. But that shul probably had more Bavli material. This was the Knesset Ash-Shema'in, the people of Eretz Yisrael, and they were a satellite community of the Eretz Yisrael Yeshiva. And this Eretz
Tell me
Yisrael,
they didn't just hobble all the quotes Sfardim into the same shul? Usually that's how they do it these days. They actually had there was a difference between those in Cairo, those emerging from Bavel, those emerging from Eretz Yisrael. These were distinct traditions.
Exactly. And so the most fascinating thing about this yeshiva is they had their own Piskei Halacha, and many times following Yerushalmi, not necessarily following the Bavli. They are their own Nusach HaTfilah, which is a shir in itself. It's completely different than what you and I are used to. All Nusach that we have nowadays, even the most Taimani to Ashkenazi, is all based on the original Babylonian one. The Eretz Yisrael one, completely different, and we didn't know about it until the Geniza.
So that also might raise halakhic questions. If you could be Yotzei davening with their Nusach then.
Exactly. It's really fascinating. They read the Torah over 3 years. That's a more well-known thing versus 1 year. And so this community had a robust leadership. Unfortunately, we don't have that many teshuvas from them, meaning Robert Brody has calculated that there's about 10,000 teshuvas from the Babylonian Gaonim. So here we're talking 20 to 30, maybe at best. It seems like they didn't really write teshuvas so much. But we have an interesting letter that I want to talk about, and about a specific Gaon of Eretz Yisrael. And we have other material also that reflects Eretz Yisrael practices. And there's a book you can find it on Otzar HaChachma from Mosad Rav Kook called Hilchot Eretz Yisrael Min HaGeniza, which is all the Eretz Yisrael based practices and the manuscripts found up to the point the book was published from the Geniza. Very interesting stuff.
Wow.
So anyway,
so what I want to get to is, so there's who's like the right. So what's like the actual shaila being raised here, if you will, and who's it being raised to?
So this is written by the Gaon of Yerushalayim. His name was Shlomo ben Yehuda, Rav Shlomo ben Yehuda, and he was the Gaon between the years 1025 and 1051. So he actually overlaps with Rav Hai Gaon, and he writes in a letter that he sent his son to go learn by Rav Hai Gaon, actually. So he's the Gaon in Jerusalem when Rav Hai Gaon is in Baghdad. And he had a very intimate relationship with the Karaites. And this letter is really about a specific incident with the Karaites and how he thinks we should properly relate to them.
Interesting. So I guess a question, and we did have an episode some time back on Karaite version of the Haggadah, which is, I guess, not as much fun because they don't have all the drush in there. But just tell us a little bit about the Karaites for a moment. What made them different than, I guess, the Rabbinites is the proper contrast,
Mhm.
and what were they seen as, using nowadays terminology? Even the term denomination doesn't sound right. Were they seen as like, just a different nusach, a different flavor, or were they essentially chutz lamachna, a different religion altogether? Certainly nowadays, we know, looking with the vision that we have now, that they are not the same religion as Rabbinic Judaism, but were they always seen as two disparate religions as we do today?
It's an excellent question for how we view the Karaites. I'll give you a little bit of the answer, but let's first introduce who they are. What we know about the Karaites is that Anan ben David, who was someone who lived around the 750s, um, the way that the Rabbinites tell the story is he was upset that he wasn't made exilarch, so he went off and broke and made his own religion, and basically denied the Torah Shebaal Peh. He denied the oral law and said we don't need to follow it. The Karaites probably had their own version where
Right.
they felt.
I imagine we probably were a little biased that we wanted to make it all sound like it was a temper tantrum. It's probably similar to some of the polemics about how Jesus started his whole movement.
Exactly. And
Toldus
the
Yeshu and
Samaritans,
others.
and yeah, all these people, someone who disgruntled went and made their own religion. Either way, Karaite Judaism caught on, and they had a pretty sizable population by the year 1029, by the time the letter, this tshuva, was written. They were, at this time, Eretz Israel and Egypt were all part of the Fatimid Empire, and the Fatimid Empire had many Karaite officials in very high positions. At one point, and a little bit later, actually, the head, like basically like the Secretary of State of the Fatimid Empire, was a Karaite Jew, and they were incredibly influential in the government, incredibly mixed in, and they were two separate communities from the rabbinites. In the traditional sources, in Arabic they refer to them as separate madhabs. A madhab in Arabic usages nowadays, it's like in the Sunni Islam, like if you have different like Sfardim, Ashkenazim, if it's like Sfardim follow Shulchan Aruch, Ashkenazim follow Ramah. So when you say madhab in Islam, it's like I follow like Hanafi, you follow Hanabali. It's like different ways of psak, in ways of following Sharia. Is
But
if
that
you're a
that makes it sound like both are equally legitimate, just different flavors is what people like to say.
Yeah, which is how they sometimes refer to them in the sources as different madhabs. This is the madhab of Kara'in. This is madhab of the Rabbanan. Now, clearly, a lot of the rabbinic people thought they were heretics, and that's going to come up in the letter also. And they tried to do what they could to push back against what they thought was kfira, but heresy. At the same time, they were intimately involved. And the issue we're going to discuss is about the issue of even intermarriage, marrying a Karaite. What is that like? Did they marry? And the answer is very much yes. The communities were still very much intermingled. And even though they had their own shuls, separate yeshivas, they were they were intimately connected in both political and social ways.
So this is kind of like, I don't know if Lahavdil, if I need to insert that here, but when we talk about, the families of Beis Shammai, the families of Beis Hillel, they would still make shidduchim between them. So it's a similar kind of vibe, it sounds like.
Exactly, and it's really fascinating. Um, and
So
mhm.
what's the question though that emerges from here? Is the question, is a rabbinite allowed to marry a Karaite, or is there something else that emerges from that?
Yeah, so let me give you a bit of the background where he states his comments. Basically, in the year 1029, there was a huge incident that happened with the Karaites. It was Hoshana Rabbah in the fall of 1029. On Hoshana Rabbah, something we also know from the Geniza, is they had a huge gathering on Har HaZeisim, on the Mount of Olives. Everyone would come for the end of Aliyah L'Regel. And at this event, they would make public announcements for the year. They would announce everyone who donated to the yeshiva and honor them. Nothing changes, right? And they would
They have
also,
all their plaques up there and all the fundraising shenanigans. Same thing.
they probably did. And they would also announce all the people in Kerem, like, stay away from these people.
Now that we got to bring back.
Yeah,
People always ask me, how do we bring more people into shul? If we had a weekly or annual Cherem announcement, who's being excommunicated from the community, I think that would definitely bring people in.
exactly. So what happens is Rabbi Shlomo ben Yehuda is the Rosh Yeshiva, so he's the main one leading the ceremony. And it's a very politically tight time with the Karaites because they're so powerful. He does the excommunications, and suddenly someone in the crowd, we have a letter, which is, and he says, someone in the crowd says, wait a second, don't we do the traditional Kerem on everybody who mixes dishes for meat and milk?
Huh.
He's AKA the Karaites, right? They don't have separate dishes for meat and milk. So he's
Right.
like, what about the traditional Kerem to excommunicate them? Now, honestly, this Hoshana Rabbah ceremony probably got delayed for a few years because of different wars that were happening in Eretz Yisrael. So it had been a while since they had last done this, probably. So someone says, I remember the last time we did this, we excommunicated all the people with mixed dishes publicly. Why are you not doing that?
I love this. It's like that old, old nunnik in the back. It's like, back in my day, we put everybody in Kerem.
Exactly. Now, Rav Shlomo ben Yehuda did not want to do it because of the political fraught nature of things. So he says, I put the Av Bezdin and told the Av Bezdin that he should go and explain to them that it's not Torah Misinai. You don't have to excommunicate the Karaites. But they weren't convinced. And so eventually the Gaon's son and two other people in the yeshiva said something that was sort of a cherem, sort of a little vague. But basically what happened is that they were reported upon and the Karaites heard about it. And Rav Shlomo ben Yehuda said, by the time I got home, the government forces were already there. The policemen were already there to arrest them.
Oy. Yikes.
So the people involved in the cherem actually got arrested. It was a huge event. And it took a lot of effort basically to repair the relationship with the Karaites to the extent that these guys could get freed from jail. Wild event.
Wow. So, I mean, this really speaks to the internal. I mean, I guess, do you call this internal strife? Depends if you are machshiv and goresh the Karaites as being within Judaism. But I'm sure the non-Jews kind of saw them, as you mentioned, as one large community. So this is kind of like a civil war taking place here.
Mm-hmm. And so during those tensions, Rav Shlomo ben Yehuda wrote a letter, and that's the letter I'd like to bring up. And he talks about the complications with it, how they're being, so rough with us. And he's trying to figure out a way to assuage the feelings of the Karaites and also stand up for themselves, like that. In the midst of that, he says, certain Jews are approaching me now, certain Rabbinite Jews, and saying, we should stop intermarrying with these Karaites. Look, they treat us so poorly. We shouldn't go and intermarry with them anymore. And what he says is astounding. Rav Shlomo ben Yehuda responds back and says, actually, I don't think you're right. He said, they're a part of Bnei Yisrael. They're a part of our people. And he says, we never see that Shevet Yehuda stopped not intermarrying with the 10 tribes, even though the 10 tribes did Avodah Zarah.
Oh, okay. That's some precedent right there.
So he says we should still keep marrying into them.
But how do you navigate that? You see, is he encouraging go marry someone who is practicing Avodah Zarah? I mean, that could be a little complicated. Like, are you going to come to shul with me on Shabbos? Are we going to keep the Yom Tovim and Halacha? What does that even look like?
It's fascinating. And I should also say, as a warning, we don't really know how much of a Talmud Chacham Rav Shlomo ben Yehuda actually was, right? He was the Rosh Yeshiva, the Gaon of Eretz Yisrael. Rav Hai Gaon has, correspondence with him. He obviously was respected. I wouldn't necessarily say that he should be any realm of hashkafa, but his opinion is fascinating for knowing that someone of the top rank would say such a thing. Definitely doesn't sound like our usual hashkafa today. People are so careful in shidduchim. They have a TV, they have a this, So actually, they're over the Avodah Zarah, but they're still Jewish.
Lowering the bar a little there.
It's really fascinating what this means, which brings us to our next point, besides the letter, is these fascinating kesubas that we found in the Geniza. Now, when we think of a kesuba, we have a set text. We know it's the same at every wedding. We have found 13 kesubas in the Geniza that have the following. They basically set out the usual things you expect in a kesuba, and then at some point it says, and the groom will not force the bride to work on her days of Yontif, and she will not force him to be machalo his Yontif.
Oh, wow. So this is like there's actual clause in there that preempts the difficulties of having, I guess, what you call, I don't know, I don't even know if intermarriage is the right term, but kind of like an intermarriage between the Rabbinite and Karaite community, and basically taking a libertarian approach. You do you, and I'll do religion my way, and Shalom al Yisrael.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And just to explain for the audience, if you're not sure, the Karaites still used to count by the moon or by the grain. So they didn't have a set calendar. So often our holidays were slightly different days, which is why you would have such a clause. But basically they're saying, yeah, she can do the Karaite Yontif, I'll do the Rabbinite Yontif, and we're going to make it work out.
So this is way more complicated than just someone from Eretz Yisrael coming to America and Yom Tov Sheish Galios. This really throws everything awry. I mean, this is within the same household, husband and wife.
It's really fascinating. We have even a later Gaon of Eretz Yisrael, his son married a Karaite, and we have the original Ksuba. Like that's how like mainstay it was.
And this is like what I just keep scratching my head. Obviously, I'm being anachronistic. I'm using the paradigms I know today. Is this like a marriage between someone yeshivish and someone modern Orthodox, or is this more like Orthodox Reform, or is this like Christian Messianic? And so I'm just trying to like figure out how far apart these two worlds were.
It's really interesting. Obviously, there's a lot of things they have in common, in terms of the basic halacha, but it is wild the degree that things are different. There's other klalim that are made also. Sometimes it goes lakula, sometimes lachumra, both directions. Meaning a Karaite, it says don't feed her klayos and yoseris akave. There's certain forbidden fats that we think you're allowed to eat, and they're not allowed to eat. And so, like, yeah, for them, they're worried about being in the same kitchen, but maybe we'll be worried about other things. Make sure that our dishes are not mixed milk and meat, you know?
So I know that there's often people will conflate the Karaites and Tzedukim, who of course are many years earlier, because they both try to take more not literal literalist readings, but they stick more closely to the text. Did they assume perhaps one of the most iconic examples is the eye for an eye? Did they read the Torah in a super literal fashion, as we tend to assume? Were they enacting the death penalty? Did they have the power to do that?
So it's an interesting question. I'm not an expert on Karaim, and I can find out some of those questions. I think that it's funny. What ends up happening is that they have, even though they deny the oral law, they end up needing to use some hermeneutical tools.
Right.
I'll tell you just a modern day example, which not all Karaite scholars agreed with. But if you ask the modern Karaite community, what is chametz on Pesach? They'll tell you anything fermented. It doesn't need to be a grain.
Hmm.
Now, you open a
Now,
chumash,
but do they have their own version of the Rabbi Blumenkrantz Pesach book, or is there
that's a
some
fascinating
Karaite Gaon who
question.
does that?
Yeah, right. But they will not have wine on Pesach, no daled kosos at the Seder because it's fermented. Anything fermented. So that's clearly a interesting reading of the Chumash, right? I wouldn't call that a literal read, but it's fascinating how you end up turning to have your own hermeneutical tradition.
Wait, so no, so new. What do they say about Gebrachs?
Right? Exactly, right? I know, right?
I think that's an important point. It wasn't just what you're saying is that they were ideological. It wasn't just simply that they were. It wasn't that they were less religious than the Rabbinites. They had their own chumrah, so to speak. They just had different ones than the Rabbinites. So it wouldn't be fair to just say the Rabbinites were more religious and the Karaites were less religious. They were serious also, it sounds like, at least from what you're telling me, and they just
Mhm.
had a completely different methodology.
Exactly. And even though there's serious hashkafa differences here, it sounds like clearly Rav Shlomo ben Yehuda is saying we should continue to marry in with them, and these ksubas show that Jews did it, right?
Right.
It actually happened.
So this is really fascinating. I appreciate this kind of a focus on this particular episode, what we learn about the Rabbinite Karaite relationships that emerged from the Cairo Geniza. Is there anything else either about the Karaim or the Cairo Geniza? Any other cool things that were discovered in there, or how maybe you came on your own journey to discover the Cairo Geniza that you want to share with our listeners before we conclude?
Sure. So let me say two things, one about the Karaites and one about the Geniza. First, with the Karaites, Rambam sort of paves the way later, Maimonides, when he says that the Karaites are Tinok Shenishba. He invents this concept, right, or not invents, or reuses an old concept from the Gemara to say that they're innocent. Only the founders of the Karaites who disagreed with the Rabbinites are the ones in trouble, but their descendants who know no better, because they just think they're following halacha purely, aren't to be blamed,
Mm-hmm.
which is an important pathway because we have pretty strict rules to deal with real heretics. And so if you're a Tinuk Shenishba, we can be lenient about a lot of things.
Right, and we super extrapolate that to virtually any non-religious person today and count them toward a minion on that basis.
Exactly. Additionally, it's also interesting that the intermarriage issue that we aren't really going to discuss, but in Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah says you can't marry a Karaite because we're concerned. This comes from a tshuva supposedly of the Rosh Mishans, that he says we're worried that their kedushin is a kedushin doraisa, but their gerushin is not a good gerushin, and therefore there might be mamzeris going on.
This sounds very familiar. I think what
Hmm.
you want to get to is the debate over a conservative rabbi performing a wedding ceremony in the 20th century debate where Moshe Rav Henkin in that whole episode.
Exactly. That is a whole episode there. It's fascinating to watch the Mefarshim, the poskim disagree about the Karaites. Are their weddings really count? Do they not count? Do they this? A lot of it is echoing and dovetailing that other
And
discussion.
going l'chumra, playing it safe in both directions.
Hmm. Honestly, nowadays it's Rav Ovadia Yosef had found reasons to be lenient because this is a relevant question, even if a Karaite, let's say someone doesn't want to be a Karaite nowadays. There's about 40,000 of them, they say statistically.
Hmm.
Let's say there's a good Karaite Jew who wants to say, I'm going to marry an Israeli girl and I'm going to become a Rabbinite. I'm going to become a regular from Jew. Can you still marry him, or is there a mamzeris issue? These are the issues that face us nowadays as a practical application of this question.
Oh, so this isn't just a question of can I put this guy into Kerem, right? If we bring back the practice of announcing the Kerems annually, but actually this has, again, the same question, the same ramifications of can the wedding take place just like they did back then? So this is fascinating. And just very briefly, how did you come to your research in the Cairo Geniza? Can you just tell us a little bit about your own involvement?
Sure, I'll tell you about my involvement and maybe give
I
you
probably
one.
should have started off with that, but better late than never.
Yeah, and maybe one or two fun facts at the end that we can leave with.
Okay, well, we are approaching the end. We have a few minutes left, so let's go for that.
Exactly. Well, I'll tell you that from the Geniza, you mentioned that I went to Revel, YU's graduate school for Jewish studies, and for anyone who wants to geek out on the Geniza, where I really got started is the Friedberg Geniza project. Albert Friedberg, Dov Friedberg, should live and be well in Toronto, basically sponsored for the entire Geniza to get digitized. So
Wow.
it's online. You can read the original, go through every manuscript. They're slowly trying to transcribe it also, but the manuscripts, 99% of them are on there. And I just had fun. And then I ended up reading a lot of books. There's Moshe Gil's book about the history of Eretz Yisrael based on the Geniza, basically, which taught me about so much of this debate. For the Karaites specifically, you can read a book by Marina Rusto about the Karaites. She's a Geniza researcher. There's so many rich things to see. If you want to know some fun facts, I'll give you another one. You mentioned 2 days Pesach, Ben Eretz Yisrael, Ben Bavel, right? You mentioned how many days do you keep if you're visiting Israel?
Hmm.
So the same Rabbi Shlomo ben Yehuda, the one we talked about, we have another letter of his in the Geniza.
Huh.
Basically, it's a draft letter, and it was supposed to be sent to the Caliph, the head of the government. We always have to ask the question in the Geniza, was something meant for the Caliph and didn't get there? Why is it in the Geniza? So we don't know if it actually got sent in the end or if this is just a rough draft and he sent the full letter. But what we have in that letter is that he says, I heard news that some of the Bavli Jews in Eretz Yisrael, the Iraqi Jews that are living in Israel, they don't want to be represented by me in the government. They want a separate representative. He says, terrible idea. Jews shouldn't have two leaders. They should all listen to me.
Great idea.
And then he goes on in the letter and says, and if you ask me, but don't they have separate shuls? They have separate Batei Knesses. They don't daven with us. They have a Bavli shul. He says, they have a separate shul because we give them a place that they can do second day yontif.
Oh, so that was already a hot topic way back when.
1,000 years ago, this letter's from about 1030. He already says that there were Bavli Jews in Eretz Yisrael that were still doing second day yontif.
Well, nothing new under the sun, right?
Yeah.
And you said, was there another fun fact?
Let's see. I mean, there's so many. I think I'm trying to think of what's a good way to end. I mean, we talked about the Rambam. We talked about the Gaonim. I know that trying to remember now if this is Geniza or this is another Teshuvah, but we certainly found just because of the season of Hanukkah, we found out from the Gaonim that there were Gaonim. There was a Teshuvah that says that they didn't do Mahadrim and a Mahadrin. That
Oh.
I actually wrote an article about this. If you Google my name, you could read about the history of how many candles to light on Hanukkah. It was on the Sfarim blog a bunch of years back. But basically, the Gaonim said, we have an Al-Tshuva where he says, only in Shul do we do Mahadrim and a Mahadrin, Mosif a Holich, one extra candle. At home, we just do Ner L'Kol Echad V'Echad.
That is fascinating. And the funny thing is, because it's near your base, so you would think you would want to go all out on your personal lighting at home. At the shul, I mean, that's a whole lumdus what the purpose is. More Persumei Nisa, or for the people who are visiting, who don't have a place to light. But that's really great. And I think that's actually a great place to end because Hanukkah is coming really soon. This is being recorded on December 18th. So Hanukkah will be here in just a few days. It's happening, I believe, on the evening of December 25th, which happens to be another holiday that I don't think we're allowed to acknowledge because we did enough things to have them announce us for the next Kerem. So hopefully that doesn't happen. Rabbi Rothblatt, thank you so much for sharing your scholarship with us. This was such an enjoyable tour of the Geniza, and I look forward to learning more from you in the future, God willing.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure to be here.